Okay, so I'm going to introduce this last session, which we're calling a panel on informal learning and outreach. And as I was just saying, I think this follows very nicely on some of what John Chase was just telling us, that songs can be successful even if they aren't necessarily teaching us a lot of specific content in terms of making people feel more positive towards science. And so our next three speakers, I think, have a lot more to say about this. And we will go in the order of Jennifer Publicover, and then Johnny Berliner, and then wrapping up with Eva Amson. I hope I was close on your name pronunciation. So Jennifer just did a master's thesis on music as a tool for environmental education and advocacy, and she's going to tell us about that next.
Thanks very much,
Jennifer.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Yes, I was the principal investigator in this study that was undertaken at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. And it is about environmental education and advocacy. And when we are tackling environmental problems, environmental education is seen as a key tool. However, simply feeding people information about the environment does not always correlate with them taking pro-environmental action on behalf of the environment. They also actually have to care about it emotionally. And the arts are well placed to deal with that sort of thing. The arts in general, including music. Affective or emotional learning is a strength of the arts. We frequently use the arts to process our values, emotions, and motivations on a wide range of life issues, including environmental ones. And then we have specifically music. Now, music without lyrics has its own non-verbal language with all sorts of different musical materials that can come together to set up musical expectations and either fulfill them or not, or send them off into a completely different direction. So music has its own internal drama even before you associate it with any particular message. You can harness it, for example, to enhance a film score. Star Wars we've got right here, or We Shall Overcome, the famous civil rights anthem of the 1960s. Now, having said this, though, if you want to harness it in the service of an environmental message, it is not to say that a particular combination of chords will automatically induce somebody to run out and commit a random act of recycling, for example. It just doesn't work that way with all the influences that we have in our lives. So you have to remember that any powers of physical, mental, or social transformation which music may have will result from a combination of social, psychological, and physical factors. So that means you have to ask very careful research questions on this topic. I chose to ask two of them. One is concerning the music itself. If music is one of the possible approaches that can be used to encourage pro-environmental thoughts and actions, then how, where, when, and why could professional musicians and environmental educators enlist music to help elicit these thoughts and actions in their audiences and networks? And the second question is about the careers and the lives of the musicians who actually do this kind of engagement. What are some of the sociological and career implications for performing musicians who engage with environment and sustainability issues in their professional and or personal lives? And what I did in order to answer these questions was to interview a cohort of musicians who had all contributed tracks to a 30-track compilation album that was released in 2011 by the environmental charity, the David Suzuki Foundation. It was called The Playlist for the Planet. Some of the album's contributors were the winners of a Canada-wide environmental song contest, and the rest were popular Canadian musicians who were specifically invited by the Suzuki Foundation. I interviewed them. Half of them consented to be interviewed quite graciously. I asked them open-ended, semi-structured questions, generally organized around how they made and presented their environment-related music, what sort of offstage pro-environmental actions they undertook in their business and lifestyle practices, the challenges, risks, and rewards that they associated with their environmental engagement, how they sought to balance entertainment and advocacy in their work, and any tips that they may have for environmental educators who wish to use music as an educational tool, and also other fellow musicians who just wish to engage with environmental themes in their art. So what I found looked like this. So within the careers and the lives of these musicians, most of whom were full-time touring professional musicians, they saw some challenges, risks, and rewards associated with their work. And within that context, they made decisions about the kind of music that they decided to create. And the decisions that they made about their music fell along 4 artistic dimensions and 5 quality dimensions. So I'm going to look at the music first, and I'm going to look at the 4 artistic dimensions, or continua, or sliding scales. Now, this is not to say that a song has to fall at a certain point along these sliding scales, but just to say that depending on each musician's musical vocabulary, their inspiration, their performing contexts, their audiences, they made choices about their songs that would fall at some point along these 4 continua, between simple and complex, between feel good and not feel good, between inclusive and adversarial, and direct versus ambiguous. So I'll quickly look at each one, just one at a time. For example, we've got simple versus complex here, and we have a picture of Remy Rodden, who is actually a full-time environmental educator from the Yukon, and many of his audiences are children, so he does a lot of classroom work, and for him, it works for him to create simply constructed songs that are catchy, that have a brain worm, that are easy to sing along with and remember. And he will get feedback from his teachers about, you know, how their kids have heard a biodiversity song and then gone into a museum a couple of weeks later that had a display on biodiversity, and they spontaneously start singing that song. So they've internalized that message. But not all of the people that I interviewed chose to express themselves in simple terms. It just depended. But you can think of music as being one form of a captivating message that can be vivid, concrete, and personal, and easy to remember, that aligns well with goals of environmental messaging in this way. But not all of them chose to make it simple. Some of them chose to make it more complex. And a related dichotomy is feel good versus not feel good. This is Tanya Tagaq. She is an Inuk throat singer from the north, and her songs don't even have words. They are collaborations with other artists. They are soundscapes. The track that she contributed to the playlist was actually called Construction, and it was full of all sorts of brutalistic and harsh sounds that represented the imposition of modernity and urban life and all the attendant problems upon the natural world, and also upon the Inuit. And she says, this is the thing when you're discussing the human condition in art. I'm not trying to make it sound good. I'm trying to express what it's like to be alive right now. So her songs are not feel-good songs, but they are genuine artistic expression on her part. And in environmental messaging, it is true that negative messages can spur greater action than positive messaging, as long as it still remains within the realm of problem-based coping, where there is still perceived hope to ameliorate the situation. But if you overdo it, it can backfire into overwhelm and inaction if it's overdone, and when it lapses into emotion-based coping. So that's a consideration when the artists are trying to balance the ups and downs of all of the songs that they have in their show. There's inclusive versus adversarial. This is David Miles. He initially got a political science degree as a younger man, but he decided to go into a career in music because it was less adversarial, and he really enjoyed the feeling of bringing people together. He said, I wanted to be the type of performer and writer that brought all sorts of people to my shows, young and old, rich and poor. And there are physiological reasons why music can be really inclusive, especially when music is being made together with other people. Making music with others makes us aware of ourselves in relation to others. It also releases oxytocin, a neurotransmitter responsible for social bonding. And the last dichotomy is direct versus ambiguous. This is Danny Michel, and he says, I just try to do it artistically and throw some images out there and let people put the puzzle together for themselves and decide however they want to feel about it. There was a study that was done on visual art. It found that there was a balance between directness and ambiguity in visual presentations, whereby there was a sweet spot where the art was perceived to be the most pleasurable when there was enough references given to the person engaging with that art to give them some orientation, but then they were left to figure out the rest of the puzzle in their own terms after that. And it stands to reason that that sort of sweet spot, that balance, can possibly exist in other art forms as well too. So the 5 quality dimensions just came forth as just general recommendations from this cohort of musicians for anybody else who wants to use environmentally themed music. Make high quality art. Keep it relevant to the audience. Recognize that there's a diversity of possible hooks depending on your own artistry. And do write from what you know and believe. Be authentic and don't preach. So here is Tarun Nair of the band Delhi to Dublin, and he speaks about quality. He says, you know, we're in the music business because art is the holy grail. Art is the reason why we're doing what we're doing, and everything else has to fall in line with that. And he says, in general, for that stuff to work, the music has to be good and ideally relevant to the audience. So if you have a classroom full of Justin Bieber fans and you pop a Neil Young song on them from an earlier generation, they may get the reference, they might not. So you need to know your audiences. And there are as many artistic hooks out there as there are artists, just depending on how you express yourself as a musician. For example, this is Todd Butler. He's a musical satirist, and he can broach very difficult issues with humor, which softens people up, gets them laughing, but also thinking at the same time about serious issues. Do write from what you know and believe. The participants said that the inspiration that they felt to write environment-related songs was the same as for their non-environmental repertoire. In other words, they were just writing about what moved them personally, and it happened to be an environmental theme for their song. So things about nature, community, consumerism, all sorts of themes that are related to environmental issues. And it's important to try to live up to what you seem to express through these original songs too. You can model your beliefs. David Miles says that there are 3 ways that musicians can show their values: through their art on stage, in their business practices, and in their lifestyles. And he recommends you got to keep it real on stage. It doesn't convince anybody if it's forced or phony. People can see through that. And so the participants have gone actually to some great lengths to live up to their environmental and social values. One of them is a conservationist. Several of them are environmental educators. One of them owns an eco-friendly landscaping firm. One of them helped to build schools in Kenya. We look at Bruce Coburn down there in the lower right-hand corner, a 45-year touring career advocating for all kinds of causes under the sun, including environmental ones. They really do try to live up to their values as best they can. And the last item was preaching, so not to do it. Preaching destroys credibility. Haley Sales says, the best way to communicate isn't by forcing it down people's throats. It's not as though they're being scolded like a kid. It's just that they're looking at you and seeing your love for something, and that hopefully inspires them to care. So very briefly, through the career and life parameters. There are things about being a touring musician that make it really hard to tread lightly on the planet, especially if you have to fly a lot. Flying has a very high carbon footprint, and all of the musicians regretted the flying that they did. David Miles says, being a musician is brutal for the environment. I fly all the time, and I think about that every time I fly. So for me to get up on stage and tell people how to live, it just doesn't feel right entirely. Other things that can eat into your own feelings of credibility to your own values are autonomous issues, like if your values and the values of your management or your venues or the festivals where you play, if those values don't mesh, you can encounter some difficulties. Tara McLean had to actually pull out of a lucrative tour because her management had arranged a sponsor for it, which she considered to be unethical from an environmental point of view and also a social point of view. And it cost her in her career. She was willing to do that. She said, my internal moral compass is that I can't mix my music with this. And they've all tried to mitigate these challenges. Jack Lavoie buys carbon offsets. Jessie Farrell puts environmental requirements into her contracts with the venues where she plays. They've all done extensive fundraising, donation schemes, advocacy, lifestyle modifications, and so on. And there are risks to their careers as well. This is Todd Butler again. He's the musical satirist, and he does a lot of corporate gigs. And if you voice an opinion that's not popular with the industry for whom you are performing, will you get called back? Who knows? He says, I've always imagined that there has been an impact on my career because of my outspokenness in certain areas. It's really hard to tell, because if somebody doesn't hire you for a gig, you don't know that they didn't hire you because they didn't call. And why didn't they call? But in the end, they all felt that the intrinsic rewards of just doing the right thing was all worth it. And the feedback that they got from their fans, and especially their younger fans, and just being able to look in the mirror and just feel that they're doing the right thing as best they can. Haley Sales says, whenever someone brings up a song to me or wants to talk about it, that to me is positive. Like, it connected with someone. They heard it, they got it, and they wanted to talk about it. But my final point that I'll make before closing out is that you do need to manage expectations when engaging with this material. Keep it real. And a veteran performer like Bruce Coburn would have this to say about that. What do you expect to get out of putting a song like that out? And one of the things you don't expect to get is that people will suddenly run out and fix it all, because they don't. And although individuals sometimes get inspired by songs, or their own inclinations are sufficiently reinforced by a song, that they will then actually take action. And that does happen sometimes. It's not something that you can expect or rely on. Most of the time, and I learned this almost right away, getting involved with issues, you better not attach yourself to the outcome. Otherwise, you just burn out. So I want to thank you all for listening to my talk. If you'd like further information about this study, there is a page on my website, which you can visit here. There's the link. It has links itself to one published paper that has come out so far on this theme. There is another paper that is in the works at the moment. It's being reviewed by another journal. And there's also a link to the original thesis from which this originally came, and abstract information, broadcast information, and so on. So thanks an awful lot. This was a real pleasure sharing this with you.